The internet didn't just blink last night, it recoiled. Because what started as subtle hints and side comments suddenly exploded into a full-blown cultural reckoning when Cardi B and 50 Cent were dragged into a conversation fans say Nicki Minaj has been dodging for years. And once the dots were connected, there was no unseeing it. Screenshots resurfaced. Old interviews hit differently. Tweets that once felt ironic now read intentional. Fans began accusing Nicki of not just flirting with controversy, but making a complete ideological pivot that stunned even longtime supporters. The phrase, full MAGA switch, started trending, and suddenly the question wasn't if her views had changed, but how long she'd been moving this way while pretending nothing was different. What sent shockwaves through hip-hop wasn't just the alleged shift, it was who allegedly stopped playing nice about it. Cardi's past political commentary came roaring back into relevance. 50 Cent's history of trolling power structures suddenly felt pointed. Fans claimed the silence between these artists wasn't accidental, it was tension. And tension always leaks. Social media erupted into chaos. Barbs fought for damage control. Critics accused Nicki of weaponizing victimhood to deflect accountability. Political commentators entered spaces they'd never touched before. And everyone seemed to be asking the same thing. If Nicki really did flip the switch, why won't she just say it out loud? Because if this really is a full pivot, it doesn't just change her image. It reframes years of behavior, alliances, and backlash that fans once explained away. And what Cardi and 50 are allegedly hinting at next could force a conversation Nicki can't outrun anymore. This isn't just rap beef. It's identity, influence, and a reckoning her fanbase never saw coming the moment the phrase, full MAGA switch, started trending alongside Nicki Minaj. Hip-hop didn't just react, it split. Not into casual debate, but into lines drawn so hard they cracked timelines in half. What shocked fans wasn't that political commentary had entered the chat. Rap has always lived in politics. What shocked them was the growing belief that Nicki's public posture hadn't merely drifted. It had pivoted, quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. And once that idea took hold, every silence, every sidestep, every old clip suddenly felt loaded. The catalyst wasn't a single tweet or interview. It was accumulation. Fans began stitching together years of moments they once dismissed as trolling or irony, likes that lingered too long, comments that dodged direct answers, deflections framed as free thought. As the archive grew, so did the suspicion that this wasn't accidental ambiguity, it was strategic distance. And when that suspicion met reactions from Cardi B and 50 Cent, the narrative escalated fast. Neither Cardi nor 50 needed to name Nicki directly. They never do. Their power has always been subtext, a pointed laugh, a side-eye comment about choosing sides, a reminder that politics isn't a costume you put on for convenience. Fans read between the lines instantly. To them, the message felt unmistakable. What Nicki was doing wasn't edgy neutrality, it was alignment. The internet exploded into excavation mode. Old interviews resurfaced where Nicki emphasized independence from political boxes. At the time, fans applauded it as boundary setting. Now, those same clips felt evasive. Why refuse to clarify when the stakes are clear? Why bristle at questions that other artists answer plainly? Commentators began arguing that refusing to disavow can function as endorsement in a climate where silence protects power. And then came the contrast. Cardi's political record, messy, outspoken, sometimes polarizing, was suddenly being reframed as consistency. She's argued publicly. She's interviewed politicians. She's taken heat for it. Love or hate her, people knew where she stood. That clarity became a measuring stick. Against it, Nicki's ambiguity started to feel less like freedom and more like insulation. 50 Cent's role added gasoline. Known for trolling politics for profit and provocation, his history with power structures is complicated, but never subtle. When he re-entered the conversation with comments about wealth, taxes, and choices, fans interpreted it as a knowing nod to the controversy. The subtext wasn't that he was endorsing anyone, it was that he recognized the playbook. And recognition from 50 reads like exposure. Barbs mobilized instantly. Defenders argued that demanding political declarations from artists is coercive. That nuance exists. That Nicki owes no one ideological purity tests. They accused critics of weaponizing politics to continue a long history of unfair scrutiny. Others added that Nicki's fanbase is global. Why center US politics at all? The defense was fierce, coordinated, and emotionally charged, but critics didn't back down. They argued this wasn't about forcing a statement, it was about patterns, about who gets amplified, about which rhetoric gets defended as free speech and which gets condemned. They pointed out that Nicki has never hesitated to speak when she feels wronged personally. So why the hesitation now? Why the irritation at questions instead of a simple clarification? The debate turned cultural. Commentators began framing the issue as a case study in celebrity influence during polarized times. When artists with massive platforms flirt with ideological symbols without context, the impact ripples far beyond music. Fans don't just consume songs, they mirror values. And when values appear to shift without explanation, trust erodes. Nicki's response, or lack thereof, became the story. No clear statement, no firm denial, no alignment acknowledged. Just frustration at being questioned. To supporters, that was proof of unfair targeting. To critics, it was the clearest signal yet, because ambiguity can be powerful, but it can also be protective. And protection in politics is rarely neutral. Meanwhile, Cardi's name kept surfacing, not as an antagonist, but as a foil. Clips of her discussing policy, calling out hypocrisy, and admitting ignorance while still engaging were shared widely. The message wasn't that Cardi is perfect, it was that she shows her work. That transparency earned credibility in a moment when vagueness felt calculated. As timelines burned, industry insiders whispered that the tension wasn't new. They claimed conversations about Nicki's political posture had been happening quietly for years, especially as her online presence grew more combative toward critics questioning her choices. According to those whispers, the frustration wasn't about disagreement, it was about accountability. About whether a superstar can leverage anti-establishment aesthetics while benefiting from the very structures she refuses to address. By the end of the day, the controversy had metastasized. It wasn't just about MAGA, it was about influence, about who gets to remain undefined while others are demanded to declare, about whether neutrality in a polarized era is a position or a shield, and about how hip-hop, a culture born from resistance, navigates power when its biggest stars sit at the table. As fans refreshed feeds waiting for clarity, one thing became undeniable. The question wasn't going away. And the longer it lingered unanswered, the louder it became. Because in an age where everything is archived, silence doesn't fade, it compounds. And the next reaction, whether from Nicki, Cardi, or 50, promised to tip this conversation from speculation into confrontation. By the time the backlash reached its second wave, the conversation was no longer about speculation. It was about consequences. What began as fan-led theory turned into a full-scale interrogation of power, influence, and intentional silence. And at the center of it all, Nicki Minaj found herself facing a scrutiny she could no longer dismiss as trolling or hate. This time, the pressure wasn't coming from rivals alone, it was coming from culture itself. The shift happened when people stopped asking what Nicki believed and started asking why she wouldn't clarify. Because in the middle of a climate where artists were being loud, messy, and imperfect about their views, Nicki's refusal to draw a line felt deliberate. Commentators pointed out that ambiguity is a luxury afforded only to those already insulated by power. When you're protected by wealth, status, and a fiercely loyal fan base, silence doesn't cost you much, but it can cost others clarity. That's when the comparisons intensified. Clips of Cardi B speaking openly about policy, admitting confusion, and still engaging resurfaced everywhere. Fans contrasted Cardi's willingness to be dragged for her opinions with Nicki's visible irritation at being questioned at all. The argument wasn't that Cardi was right, it was that she was present. And presence, in a polarized moment, carries weight. The conversation took a sharper edge when industry voices began chiming in anonymously. Several insiders claimed that Nicki's team had long advised her to stay vague on politics because it preserved maximum reach. No alienation, no loss of international appeal, no backlash from powerful demographics. If true, that strategy reframed the controversy entirely. This wasn't about personal belief, it was about brand management. And that revelation didn't sit well with fans who once believed Nicki's defiance was rooted in authenticity. Then 50 Cent re-entered the discourse without saying much at all. A repost here, a sarcastic caption there. Fans interpreted it as acknowledgement, not endorsement. 50 has always thrived in gray areas, but the difference is he never pretends they're invisible. His entire persona is built on saying the uncomfortable part out loud. That's why his subtle engagement felt louder than Nicki's avoidance. To many, it looked like a veteran recognizing a familiar maneuver and letting the audience draw its own conclusions. Barbs pushed back harder than ever. They argued that forcing Nicki into a political corner was hypocritical in a genre that once prided itself on anti-establishment thinking. They accused critics of selectively demanding accountability from a woman who had already been overpoliced throughout her career. And they weren't wrong about one thing: Nicki has always been scrutinized differently. The question was whether that history now shielded her from legitimate critique. As the debate escalated, another uncomfortable layer emerged. People began revisiting Nicki's past alliances, statements, and defenses, not just politically, but culturally. Who she defended, who she attacked, who she dismissed as haters. Patterns emerged that fans could no longer unsee. What once felt like chaotic loyalty now looked ideological. And once ideology enters the chat, neutrality disappears. The media response didn't help. Mainstream outlets tiptoed around the issue, careful not to inflame a fanbase known for mobilizing aggressively. That silence from press institutions only intensified the online fire. Independent commentators filled the gap, arguing that fear of backlash was shaping coverage just as much as fear of being wrong. And that dynamic mirrored the very criticism being leveled at Nicki. Why does power always get the benefit of the doubt? That question trended briefly, then vanished, but the sentiment lingered. Fans weren't just upset about politics. They were frustrated by what felt like selective accountability. Artists with less clout are forced to answer. Superstars are allowed to deflect. And in a genre built on truth-telling, that imbalance felt like betrayal. Nicki's reactions grew sharper. Instead of clarifying, she pushed back against the premise of the conversation itself. She framed the questioning as harassment, as obsession, as another attempt to tear her down. And while many sympathized with her exhaustion, others argued that reframing accountability as attack was itself a tactic, one that shut down dialogue without addressing substance. Meanwhile, Cardi stayed largely quiet, but her past words kept speaking for her. Fans noted that Cardi didn't need to respond because she already had. Her record was public, her contradictions owned, her engagement messy but visible. In contrast, Nicki's silence grew louder with every passing hour, and in the vacuum, interpretations multiplied. By the end of the week, the narrative had hardened. This was no longer about whether Nicki supported MAGA explicitly. It was about whether she was willing to acknowledge the impact of her ambiguity, about whether influence carries responsibility even when silence is chosen, and about whether refusing to clarify in a moment like this is itself a political act. Insiders hinted that pressure was mounting internally, that conversations were happening about whether to finally address the issue head-on or let it burn out, that sponsors were watching, that collaborators were nervous, because once controversy shifts from gossip to values, the stakes change. People don't just listen differently, they choose differently. And just when it seemed like the debate had reached exhaustion, a final rumor began circulating quietly, that a response was coming. Not a tweet, not a rant, but a calculated statement designed to reframe everything at once. If that move happens, it could either calm the fire or ignite it beyond control. And as fans waited, one truth became impossible to ignore. Silence had already spoken. The only question left was whether Nicki was ready to answer it. By the time the third phase of the backlash settled in, the debate stopped chasing proof and started confronting meaning. The culture had moved past screenshots and subtext and into a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What does influence require when silence becomes the loudest message in the room? And whether she intended it or not, Nicki Minaj had become the symbol at the center of that reckoning. The temperature changed when fans realized this wasn't a moment, it was a posture. For years, Nicki's ambiguity had been read as independence, a refusal to be boxed in by expectations. But now, in a climate where neutrality itself is scrutinized, that posture felt less rebellious and more strategic. Commentators began arguing that refusing to clarify isn't the same as refusing to comply. It's refusing to be accountable. And accountability, they said, isn't about pledging allegiance, it's about acknowledging impact. That's when the contrast sharpened again. Cardi B didn't need to re-enter the conversation. Her earlier engagement, imperfect, public, sometimes contradictory, kept resurfacing as evidence of willingness. Fans noted that she absorbed criticism head-on, admitted when she didn't know enough, and still showed up. In a debate about responsibility, that history mattered. It wasn't about who had the right politics. It was about who showed their work. And then there was 50 Cent, whose role crystallized into something almost meta. He never pretended to be principled in the way people expect from activists. His brand has always been blunt realism. So when his comments and reposts skimmed the edge of the controversy, audiences interpreted it as a veteran signaling that he recognized the mechanics at play. Not endorsement, not exposure, recognition. And in hip-hop, recognition from someone like 50 carries a weight that explanations can't dilute. As the days passed, the internet stopped waiting for a denial and started mapping consequences. Playlists were debated. Collaborations were reevaluated. Fans asked whether they could separate art from ambiguity. Critics asked whether they should. The question wasn't whether Nicki would lose her fan base. She wouldn't. The question was whether the culture would stop granting her the benefit of interpretive silence. Because once ambiguity is read as choice, it no longer floats above critique. Nicki's pushback, when it came, didn't clarify, it reframed. She challenged the premise of the scrutiny, casting it as harassment fueled by obsession. For many supporters, that landed. They've watched her endure relentless targeting for years. Fatigue is real. But others argued that reframing accountability as persecution doesn't resolve the underlying concern. It closes the door on dialogue while leaving the question intact. That's when the debate turned inward. Fans began interrogating their own expectations. Do artists owe clarity? Is demanding it a form of control? Or is it a response to platforms so large they shape public perception, whether they intend to or not? The arguments weren't clean, they overlapped, they contradicted. And that messiness was the point. Culture doesn't evolve through tidy conclusions, it evolves through friction. Industry insiders added a final, sobering layer. They suggested that the long-term impact wouldn't show up in charts or headlines, but in trust. In whether collaborators felt comfortable aligning publicly. In whether brands weighed ambiguity as risk. In whether journalists stopped tiptoeing. None of that explodes overnight. It accumulates. And accumulation is what turned this conversation from rumor into reckoning. Meanwhile, Nicki continued to do what she has always done best: command attention without explanation. She posted, she performed, she dominated timelines on her own terms. To supporters, that was proof she didn't need to answer anyone. To critics, it was confirmation that power insulates. Both readings could be true at the same time. That paradox became the story's final tension. By the end of the cycle, something subtle but significant had shifted. The culture didn't cancel Nicki. It didn't crown Cardi. It didn't anoint 50 as arbiter. What it did was recalibrate its expectations. Ambiguity stopped being read as edgy neutrality and started being weighed as a choice with consequences. Silence stopped being invisible and started being interpreted. And that's the part that won't fade. Because in an era where every move is archived, what you don't say sits alongside what you do. And when fans feel the gap between influence and accountability widen, they fill it with interpretation. That interpretation may not be fair. It may not be precise, but it becomes reality in the absence of clarity. As the dust settled, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't about MAGA labels or partisan lines anymore. It was about the evolving contract between artists and audiences. About whether refusing to engage is still rebellion, or whether it's simply opting out of responsibility while keeping the benefits of power. Nicki may never issue the statement people expect. She may never need to, but the conversation she sparked by not speaking has already reshaped how silence is read in hip-hop. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse quietly. The era of interpretive silence is ending. What replaces it won't be neat, and it won't be comfortable. But it will demand one thing the culture has been circling all along: acknowledgement that influence, once earned, doesn't disappear just because you refuse to define it. If you're still here, understand this. You didn't just watch a rap debate, you watched culture redraw its boundaries in real time. This wasn't about picking sides. This was about power, silence, and what happens when influence refuses to explain itself. Moments like this don't fade quietly. They linger, they reshape expectations, and they decide what artists can get away with next. Don't scroll past like this didn't challenge how you see celebrity, accountability, and loyalty. If this conversation made you uncomfortable, that's the point. Discomfort is where the real shifts happen. Hit like right now so this discussion doesn't get buried under safer, easier narratives. Drop a comment with what you really think, not the version you think will get likes, but the honest one. Because the comment section is where the culture actually argues itself forward. And subscribe immediately, because this story is not over. Whether it's a response, a reframing, or continued silence, the next move will matter, and you don't want to be catching up after the narrative has already hardened without you in the room. People will try to water this down. They'll say it's just politics, just trolling, just noise, but anyone paying attention knows better. Silence at this level isn't empty, it's strategic. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Stay locked in, stay critical. Because the next time an artist chooses not to speak, you'll know exactly why and what that silence is really saying.